On a rainy November evening in 1995, a 16-year-old chemistry student stepped out of a taxi onto a remote bridleway in Surrey. The driver watched her stand motionless in the rain, looking around as if waiting for someone. That was the last confirmed sighting of Ruth Wilson. 1 year later, security cameras captured a distressed young woman frantically buying every newspaper covering her own disappearance. What happened in those 30 years would become one of Britain's most haunting cold cases. The phone wouldn't stop ringing. Ian Wilson stood in the hallway that Tuesday evening, asking the same question over and over. "Have you seen Ruth?" Each negative answer tightened the knot in his stomach. Behind him, Karen wrapped her arms around herself, and their younger daughter Jenny watched from the stairs with wide, worried eyes. It was nearly 7 o'clock on the 27th of November, 1995, and Ruth Wilson hadn't come home. But to understand what happened, you need to know who Ruth was, the girl behind the mystery, the life she lived when everything still seemed ordinary. Ruth Elizabeth Wilson was 16 years old, born on the 31st of January, 1979, in the quiet Surrey village of Betchworth. She was the kind of teenager adults pointed to as an example. Academically brilliant, musically gifted, responsible, mature beyond her years. A sixth-form student at the Ashcombe School, she pursued A-levels in chemistry and biology with laser focus. Her teachers saw Oxford or Cambridge in her future. Her parents saw vindication of everything they'd worked for. Music defined her in ways academics never quite could. She'd started piano at 7, her fingers moving across keys until the movements became instinctive. By her teens, she'd picked up electric guitar, learning rock songs when she was supposed to be studying. She sang in the choir at St. Michael's Church every Sunday, her voice clear and steady. She played handbells, that peculiarly English tradition requiring mathematical precision. She'd even begun learning the organ, spending hours at the church practicing Bach and Handel. For Ruth, music was the space where she could be someone other than Ian Wilson's eldest daughter, other than the girl who always had her homework done early. Her social world centered on school and church. Will Kennedy had been her boyfriend until 6 months earlier, and the breakup had been amicable enough that they'd remained close friends. He was steady, reliable, the kind of boy parents approved of. Catherine Mayer was her real confidant, the friend she could talk to for hours on the phone. When Catherine's family moved to Sheffield in the autumn of '95, Ruth felt the loss acutely. Ben Anderton was slightly older, a bit outside her usual circle, but trustworthy. These three formed the core of Ruth's world outside her family. She worked Saturdays at a music shop in Dorking. The job wasn't about the money, though she saved her wages with discipline. It was about having somewhere to be that wasn't home, wasn't school, wasn't under constant parental observation. She also babysat for neighbors, another way to earn small freedoms. Ian Wilson was a science teacher and local parish councillor. He approached parenting with structure, clear expectations, and unwavering belief in doing things properly. He loved his daughters through provision, through guidance, through maintaining standards. When Ruth brought home imperfect grades, his disappointment came as quiet lectures about wasted potential. When she excelled, his pride was genuine but measured. He was, by all accounts, a good father, just not an easy one. Karen Wilson, his second wife, had married into the family when Ruth was just a toddler. She'd become the only mother Ruth really remembered, taking that role seriously, attending every school event, helping with homework, maintaining household routines. She was warmer than Ian, more emotionally accessible, but she carried the burden of being a stepmother who could never quite forget she wasn't the original. She loved Ruth and Jenny completely, but everyone knew there was a ghost in the house, a presence felt most in what was never discussed. Jenny Wilson, 3 years younger, worshipped her older sister. Ruth was everything Jenny aspired to be, smarter, more talented, more confident. But the age gap meant different worlds. Jenny was still navigating secondary school while Ruth moved in the sophisticated sixth-form realm. They shared a home, shared parents, shared a history, but weren't particularly close. That history was Nesta Wilson, Ruth's biological mother, who had passed away on the 10th of December, 1982. Ruth had been 3 years old. Jenny had been an infant. The story they'd grown up with was simple. Their mother had fallen down the stairs. A terrible accident. Ian had remarried within a year, and Karen had stepped into the role seamlessly. The family had absorbed the tragedy and moved forward. They didn't talk about Nesta much. The narrative was settled, complete, filed away. Except it wasn't true. Sometime in November of 1995, Ruth discovered that her mother hadn't fallen at all. Nesta Wilson had ended her own life deliberately. For 13 years, Ian and Karen had maintained the lie, believing they were protecting their daughters. They'd succeeded so completely that Ruth had never questioned it. She traveled to London alone, navigated Somerset House bureaucracy, requested her mother's death certificate, and there it was, spelled out plainly. Not an accident, a choice, she told no one. Not Catherine, despite their long phone conversations. Not Will Kennedy, not even Jenny. Ruth carried this knowledge alone, and it changed something fundamental inside her. The girl everyone thought they knew was dealing with a revelation that upended her entire understanding of family, identity, self. The timing made it worse. The 13th anniversary of Nesta's death was approaching, the 10th of December, just weeks away. Ruth, who excelled at chemistry and biology, who understood genetics and heredity, must have wondered what else she'd inherited from the mother she couldn't remember. If her mother could make that choice, did that mean the same capacity existed inside her? In the weeks before that Tuesday, people noticed small changes. She'd hidden a recent school report. She'd told Catherine she didn't want to go home anymore, that the house felt suffocating. She'd asked about moving to Sheffield with urgent desperation Catherine hadn't recognized. A month earlier, Ruth had spent 2 nights at Ben Anderton's house, hiding. There had been a scene when his parents discovered her. Apologies were made. Promises extracted. Ruth came home. But something had broken that couldn't be fixed. The weekend before seemed different, though. Saturday, the 25th of November, she worked her regular shift at the music shop. That evening, she went to dinner with Will Kennedy and Neil Phillipson. They would remember one detail. Ruth insisted on paying for everyone's meal. It wasn't like her to spend money so freely. "My treat," she'd said, and something in her voice stopped any argument. Sunday was even more normal. Handbell practice at St. Michael's in the morning. Youth group in the afternoon. Supper with the Kennedy family that evening, where Mrs. Kennedy pressed old clothing on her and Ruth accepted graciously. When she walked home that night, Ian and Karen watched her settle into the sitting room with a book. She seemed relaxed, Karen would tell police later, more peaceful than she'd been in weeks. They thought whatever had been bothering her had resolved itself. They thought the worst was over. That peaceful Sunday evening was the last normal moment the Wilson family would ever have. The morning of Tuesday, November 27th, began with tension that no one recognized as a warning. Ian Wilson stood in the kitchen at 7:30, briefcase in one hand, coffee cup in the other, stress radiating from his shoulders like heat off pavement. An Ofsted inspection was scheduled for later that week, and the pressure had turned him sharp-edged and irritable. The kitchen smelled of burnt toast and instant coffee, the radio muttering news in the background. Ruth sat at the table with her Walkman headphones on, nodding to music only she could hear, blocking out the world the way teenagers do when they need space from parents who expect too much. Ian said something about the volume. Ruth didn't respond, lost in whatever song was playing. He said it again, louder this time, his voice cutting through the music. "Ruth, turn that down." She pulled the headphones down around her neck and looked at him, her expression unreadable. "I can't hear myself think with that noise," Ian said, gathering papers from the counter. "I wasn't bothering anyone," Ruth said quietly. "You're bothering me. Some of us have actual responsibilities today." The words hung in the air between them, sharper than he'd intended. Karen hovered near the sink, not intervening, her hands wrapped around her own mug, waiting for the moment to pass. It did. Ian grabbed his things and left for work, the front door closing with unnecessary force. Karen followed 10 minutes later, calling goodbye up the stairs, her footsteps quick on the gravel path outside. The cottage fell silent except for the ticking of the clock in the hallway. Ruth and Jenny were alone. 8 o'clock. The school bus would arrive at the end of Wanham Lane in 15 minutes. The same bus Ruth had taken nearly every weekday for the past 5 years, following the same route through Surrey villages to the Ashcombe school, where her chemistry teacher would mark her absent by 9. But that morning, Ruth turned to her younger sister, who was shoving books into her backpack, and said something that would replay in Jenny's mind for decades afterward. "I'm not taking the bus today." Jenny looked up. "Why not?" "Just not," Ruth said. Her voice was calm, matter of fact, the tone you use when you've already decided something and don't intend to explain. Jenny shrugged, used to her older sister's occasional unpredictability, and gathered her own school things. She walked to the bus stop alone, her breath fogging in the cold November air. Behind her, Ruth stayed in the cottage that suddenly felt larger, emptier, full of possibility or danger, depending on what was going through her mind in those quiet moments after everyone left. 8:15. A car pulled up outside the cottage, engine idling. Will Kennedy had driven past on his way to school and seen movement through the window. He rolled down his window, cold air rushing into the warm car. "Ruth! Need a ride?" he called out. Ruth came to the door, the small blue duffel bag already in her hand. She looked at Will, at his car with its familiar clutter of cassette tapes and school folders on the passenger seat, at the easy solution to getting to school on time. "No thanks," she said. "I'm fine." "You sure? It's freezing out." "I'm sure." Will nodded, waved, drove away, his tires crunching on the gravel. Years later, he would describe that moment with precision, the way she stood in the doorway backlit by the hall light, the bag already packed, the expression on her face that seemed, in retrospect, like someone who'd already made a decision and wasn't going to be swayed from it. He was the last friend who would see Ruth Wilson. What Ruth did between 8:15 and 11:30 remains unknown. 3 hours and 15 minutes unaccounted for. A void where anything could have happened, or nothing at all. Perhaps she sat at the kitchen table where she'd argued with her father that morning, the house creaking around her in that way old cottages do, full of small, settling noises that sound like footsteps when you're alone. Perhaps she moved through rooms touching things, the piano keys in the sitting room, her mother's old photograph tucked in the bookshelf, the banister where Nesta Wilson supposedly fell but actually chose to end everything. Perhaps she simply waited, watching the clock hands crawl toward the moment when she'd execute whatever plan had formed during those peaceful hours on Sunday evening. 11:30. Ruth called a taxi from the phone in the hallway, her fingers steady on the rotary dial. The driver who took the call logged the pickup address and the destination, Dorking Town Center. 15 minutes through Surrey countryside that was brown and gray with late November, trees stripped bare like skeletons, fields lying fallow under low clouds. The driver would remember his passenger as quiet, composed, nothing remarkable except how she sat perfectly still in the back seat, not fidgeting the way teenagers usually did, not chatting or asking to change the radio station. She paid the fare when they arrived on Dorking High Street and stepped out into the market town where she'd spent countless Saturdays, where every shopkeeper knew her face. 12 o'clock. The bell above the door chimed as Ruth pushed into Thistle's Florists. The shop smelled overwhelmingly of roses and lilies, that cloying sweetness of too many flowers in too small a space. The woman behind the counter looked up from arranging a funeral wreath, carnations and baby's breath in her hands. "Help you, love?" "I'd like to order flowers," Ruth said. "For delivery." The florist wiped her hands on her apron and pulled out an order form. "What were you thinking? Something expensive, something that makes an impression." The woman's eyebrows rose slightly at the request from a teenager, but she nodded. "For a special occasion?" "Just because," Ruth said. She gave the delivery address, her own home on Wanham Lane, the recipient, Karen Wilson, and then the detail that would haunt investigators later. "I need them delivered Wednesday, November 29th, not before." The florist noted it all down, accepted payment from notes. Ruth counted out carefully. "Would you like a card with that?" "No card," Ruth said. "Just the flowers." She left the shop, the bell chiming again behind her, and walked 3 blocks through the cold afternoon to Dorking Library. 12:30. The library doors were heavy, the hinges squeaking as Ruth pulled them open. Inside, the air was warmer, thick with the smell of old paper and furniture polish, and that particular mustiness that accumulates in buildings full of books. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in harsh white light. Ruth found a table in the back corner, away from the reference desk where staff members sorted returns, away from the handful of other patrons scattered through the stacks. She set her blue bag on the chair beside her and sat down. 4 hours. 4 hours in that library, while outside the sky darkened and rain began to fall. First as mist, then as steady drizzle that streaked the windows. What she did in that time remains one of the great mysteries. Did she sit with a pen and paper, composing the 3 farewell letters that would later be found at Betchworth Quarry? Did she write to her father? "I'm sorry, Dad. I found out about Mum. I can't pretend anymore." Did she write to Karen? "Thank you for trying. You were good to me. This isn't your fault." Did she write to Catherine? To Will? To someone whose name would never be made public? Or did she research, flipping through reference books, making notes, planning escape routes for a 16-year-old with no passport, no driver's license, no legal way to disappear? The library staff would later say they didn't specifically remember her, which meant she'd blended in perfectly, just another student at a table, head bent over work, unremarkable until she became the most remarkable absence in Surrey's history. 4 o'clock. Ruth gathered her things. Through the library windows, the afternoon had turned dark and miserable, rain coming harder now, drumming against glass. She walked to Dorking railway station, her red jumper already damp, her hair plastered to her face. At the taxi rank, she approached the first car and tapped on the window. The driver rolled it down. "Where to?" "Love." "Boxell," Ruth said. "The bridleway near the hand-in-hand pub." The driver, a man in his 50s who'd been doing this route for 20 years, glanced at her in the rearview mirror as she climbed in. Something about the request felt wrong. Boxell on a Tuesday afternoon in November rain? But passengers requested strange things sometimes. Not his job to question. The wipers scraped rhythmically across the windshield as they climbed from Dorking toward the North Downs. Ruth sat in the back seat, that blue bag on her lap, watching the world outside grow wilder. Houses disappeared, trees pressed close. The road wound through landscape that felt increasingly remote despite being only a few miles from town. "Miserable day for a walk," the driver said, trying for conversation. "Yes," Ruth said. "Meeting someone up there? Maybe." The vagueness of her answer bothered him, but he drove on. They passed the main Boxell car park, empty except for one other vehicle, and continued to the more remote bridleway. The track narrowed, gravel crunching under tires, branches scraping the car's sides. He stopped where the path proper began, where vehicles couldn't go further. 4:30 in the afternoon. The light was already dying, that premature dusk of late November afternoons. Ruth counted out exact change for the fare. "You sure about this?" the driver asked. "It's really coming down." "I'm sure," Ruth said. "Thank you." She opened the door and stepped into the rain. And then she did something that would bother the driver for 3 decades. Something so strange, he'd describe it to police with absolute clarity. Something he'd replay in his mind, wondering if he should have stayed, should have insisted she get back in the car. She didn't walk away. She just stood there on the muddy bridleway, rain soaking through her velvet trousers, turning her red jumper dark and heavy. She stood motionless, her head turning slowly from left to right, scanning the empty path, the dark woods crowding on either side, the gray nothing of rain and mist and approaching night, looking around, looking for someone, waiting for someone who wasn't there yet or who would never come at all. The driver watched for a long moment, engine idling, windshield wipers still going. Should he say something? She was 16, old enough to make her own choices, but dressed entirely wrong. Those pixie boots, with no tread, that velvet soaked through, no coat, no umbrella. Finally, he put the car in reverse. Professional distance. Not his problem. He backed down the narrow track, turned around where the path widened, and drove away. In his rearview mirror, he caught one last glimpse. Ruth Wilson standing alone in the rain, that blue bag hanging from her shoulder, her face turned toward the woods as if she heard something calling from deep inside them. Then the trees blocked his view. The car rounded a bend. She was gone. The rain fell harder. Darkness came fully now, 4:30 becoming 5 o'clock, the woods turning black around that lonely bridleway. Boxell, swarming with hikers on sunny weekends, was utterly deserted. The bridleway was mud and dead leaves and standing water. Nearby, though Ruth couldn't see it in the darkness and rain, was Betchworth Quarry, steep drops, abandoned workings, places where someone could disappear completely. She was dressed for a car ride, for an indoor destination, for being picked up by someone who would drive her away from here. But she'd come to this exact spot deliberately. 2 taxis, 4 hours in a library. Flowers ordered for delivery in 2 days. Every action suggested planning, intention, decisions made with the precision of someone who studied chemical reactions and biological systems and understood cause and effect. And now here she was, standing in the rain at the edge of Boxell, looking around for someone who may or may not have existed, waiting for something that may or may not have been coming. What happened in the next minutes or hours, after the taxi's taillights disappeared and Ruth Wilson stood alone on that bridleway, no one knows. Did headlights cut through the rain, a car pulling up, a door opening, Ruth climbing inside to be driven toward whatever new life she'd planned? Did she walk deeper into the woods, following some internal compass toward the quarry edge where her letters would later be found? Did something terrible happen in those dark trees, something violent and final that left no trace? Or did Ruth Wilson simply step off the edge of one existence and into another, vanishing so completely that thermal cameras and search dogs and 60 volunteers would find nothing but silence? The rain kept falling through the night, washing away footprints, erasing evidence, drowning any sounds that might have carried through the trees. And Ruth Wilson, 16 years old, dressed in velvet and pixie boots, disappeared into the November darkness as if she'd never existed at all. Somewhere in Betchworth, her family was just beginning to worry. Somewhere in that cottage on Wanham Lane, Ian was calling her friends. Karen was checking her room. Jenny was sitting on the stairs wondering where her sister had gone. But here, on this lonely bridleway in the rain, there was only absence. Only the woods and the darkness and the terrible, absolute silence of someone who was there one moment and gone the next, leaving behind nothing but questions that would echo for 30 years. The panic started slowly. Ian Wilson arrived home at 5:30 that Tuesday evening, mind churning through Ofsted preparation. Barely registering Ruth's coat wasn't by the door. Karen returned 20 minutes later, calling hello to the empty house. Jenny was already home with homework. It wasn't until 6 o'clock, dinner ready and Ruth still absent, that concern pulled tight in Karen's chest. "Has Ruth come home yet?" she asked Jenny. "I haven't seen her since this morning. She said she wasn't taking the bus." "What do you mean?" Ian's voice came sharp from the kitchen. The looks between Ian and Karen held 13 years of shared parenting, of knowing when something was wrong. Ian went to the phone, dialed the Ashcombe school, closed. He tried the head of sixth form's direct line. "David, it's Ian Wilson. Was Ruth in classes today? Papers rustling. Let me check." "No, actually. Marked absent from morning registration." "Everything all right?" Ian's hand tightened on the receiver. "I'm sure it's fine. Thanks." He hung up. Karen was already heading upstairs to Ruth's bedroom. He heard her footsteps overhead, moving quickly, wardrobe to desk to bookshelf. She came back down, shaking her head. "Her blue bag's gone. Her Walkman. I can't tell what else." Ian dialed Will Kennedy's house. "Margaret, it's Ian Wilson. Is Ruth there by any chance?" "Ruth? No, I haven't seen her since Sunday. Is something wrong?" He tried Catherine's number in Sheffield. University lectures. Tried Ben Anderton. No answer. 3 more school friends. Each negative response made his voice tighter. Karen beside him with arms wrapped around herself. Jenny watching from the doorway with widening eyes. By 7 o'clock, Ian called Surrey police. Missing person. 16 years old. Failed to attend school. Not returned home. The officer was sympathetic but not alarmed. Teenage runaways happened constantly. She'd probably gone to a friend's house, would come home sheepish by bedtime. But he took down details, promised someone would be in touch. Ian drove to Dorking, checking the high street, library, music shop, all closed, windows dark, streets empty. He drove past every place Ruth might have gone. Nothing. Just November darkness and growing certainty that something was very wrong. By 9 o'clock, Surrey police elevated the case to urgent missing person. The officer called back with more questions, his tone notably more serious. Had Ruth seemed depressed? Family arguments? Boyfriend? "There's something else," the officer said. A taxi driver called in. Picked up a girl matching Ruth's description from Betchworth this morning. Drove her to Dorking. Then, another taxi company reported a second fare. 4 o'clock this afternoon, teenage girl from Dorking railway station to Boxell. The words hit Ian like a physical blow. Boxell? Why would she go there? We're mobilizing a search team now. Helicopter with thermal imaging. Ground units with dogs. The search began at 10 o'clock that night. Helicopters circled overhead. Searchlights sweeping dark woods. Rotor blades thumping through the North Downs. On the ground, police in high-visibility jackets spread out, calling Ruth's name into darkness, voices swallowed by undergrowth and lingering rain. German shepherds strained at leads, noses to muddy ground. Thermal cameras scanned through canopy, looking for heat signatures. Ian and Karen stood at the search area edge, clutching paper cups of tea from a mobile command unit, watching lights sweep through trees. Will Kennedy's parents came offering support. Ben Anderton arrived, looking stricken. This is where the second taxi dropped her, a police officer explained, pointing to a muddy bridleway. Driver said she got out around 4:30, just stood there in the rain, not walking anywhere, like she was waiting for someone. Waiting for who? Karen's voice cracked. We don't know yet, Mrs. Wilson. The search continued through the night. Midnight, 1, 2, the helicopter made grid patterns revealing foxes and deer but no teenage girl. Dogs covered miles, occasionally pulling hard only to find crisp packets or nothing. Ground teams moved methodically, torch beams cutting through mist. But Boxell is vast, over 500 acres of woodland and grassland, walking trails and steep slopes and abandoned quarry workings with sheer drops into darkness. By dawn Wednesday, the search had found nothing. No Ruth. No evidence of where she'd gone after standing on that bridleway. No tracks. No disturbed undergrowth. No signs of struggle. The thermal imaging blank. The dogs finding nothing beyond the drop-off point. As if Ruth Wilson had simply evaporated. Ian and Karen returned home as sun rose, exhausted and hollow-eyed. Jenny was still awake, curled in the sitting room chair. When she saw their faces, she knew. The three sat together in gray morning light, not speaking, listening to phone ring with updates that weren't updates, still searching, nothing yet. At 9:30 Wednesday morning, a delivery van pulled up. Karen answered the door to find a man holding an expensive bouquet, roses and lilies and carnations in crystal vase. Delivery for Karen Wilson, he said cheerfully. Karen took the flowers automatically, hands trembling. No card. She carried it inside, set it on the kitchen table, stared at it with growing horror. Ian, she called out, voice barely above whisper. Come here. He appeared, saw the flowers, saw Karen's face. Ruth ordered these. She must have. Before Karen couldn't finish. Ian picked up the delivery receipt from the floor. Monday. She ordered them Monday for delivery today. His daughter had known, had planned, had arranged for flowers to arrive 2 days after she vanished. Police arrived within the hour to collect the flowers as evidence. Meanwhile, the search intensified. Wednesday brought daylight, dry weather, massive mobilization. By December 1st, 4 days after Ruth's disappearance, 60 people had gathered, school friends, teachers, National Trust wardens, quarry employees. They spread in careful grid pattern, marking off sections as they combed through undergrowth and peered down quarry edges. At 11 o'clock that morning, a volunteer searching Betchworth Quarry's top edge found something. He called out, waving to police. People converged on the location, a partially concealed spot where quarry rim met dense woodland. There, arranged almost carefully, were items that made everyone's blood run cold. 3 envelopes in Ruth's handwriting, one to Dad, one to Karen, one to a name never made public. Beside them lay empty paracetamol packets, multiple, enough to suggest lethal dose, and a vermouth bottle, half empty, cap screwed back on. Police cordoned off the area immediately. Forensic teams photographed everything, bagged evidence. Ian and Karen were brought to the station to review the letters, sitting in an interview room reading their daughter's words, apology, explanation, goodbye. Ruth had known what she was doing. Ruth had planned this. Ruth had come to Boxell intending to end things. But where was her body? If Ruth had taken lethal paracetamol 4 days ago, she would be dead by now. Liver failure slowly, painfully, over 24 to 72 hours. She would have become increasingly ill, unable to walk far, certainly unable to hide so thoroughly that thermal imaging and search dogs and 60 volunteers couldn't find her, unless she'd walked somewhere else after leaving the letters, unless someone had taken her away, unless the letters and pills were diversion, meant to make everyone think one thing, while she did something else entirely. The search continued 2 more days, expanding to wider areas. Police contacted hospitals across Surrey and neighboring counties. They reviewed CCTV from Dorking, looking for where Ruth went during those 4 hours between ordering flowers and calling the second taxi. They interviewed library staff who couldn't specifically recall her. They interviewed every friend, asking if she'd mentioned plans to run away, if she'd seemed troubled, if there was anyone else who might have been involved. They found nothing. No additional evidence. No witnesses after 4:30 Tuesday. No body despite searches examining every inch of accessible terrain. The letters suggested goodbye. The paracetamol suggested method. But Ruth Wilson herself remained stubbornly, impossibly absent. By week's end, Operation Scholar, Surrey Police's code name for Ruth's case, had consumed hundreds of police hours and found only questions. The cottage on Wanham Lane felt like a mausoleum. Ruth's room untouched, piano silent, parents moving through days like ghosts. Christmas was coming, and celebrating without knowing whether their daughter was alive or dead was unbearable. The search continued, though with less intensity now, hope of finding Ruth alive fading each day, replaced by grim determination to at least find her body, to answer what happened when a 16-year-old girl stepped out of a taxi and vanished into darkness, leaving behind nothing but letters and empty pill packets and questions that would echo for 30 years. December 1995 felt like the longest month in the Wilson family's history. The cottage on Wanham Lane now felt cavernous and cold. Christmas decorations stayed boxed in the attic. Ruth's stocking remained folded in a drawer because neither parent could bear to hang it or throw it away. Jenny moved through the house like a ghost. Ian and Karen existed in suspended animation, waiting for news that never came. The media descended quickly. Missing. Surrey schoolgirl ran in local papers with Ruth's school photo. On the 15th of December, Ian and Karen sat on This Morning under bright lights facing cameras. "We believe Ruth is alive," Ian said, voice steady despite trembling hands. "We believe she's somewhere out there, afraid to come home. Ruth, if you're watching, please just let us know you're safe." Beside him, Karen clutched a tissue. "Whatever happened, we love you. Please come home." The appearance generated hundreds of calls. Reported sightings flooded in: Yorkshire, London, Manchester. Each lead dead-ended. Wrong girl, mistaken identity, useless. 1996 arrived without celebration. Ian returned to teaching, throwing himself into work. Karen tried returning but lasted 3 days before other people's children became unbearable. Operation Scholar remained officially active, but daily searches had stopped. Without new leads, without a body, there was nowhere to go. Mark Williams Thomas, the family liaison officer, visited regularly, patient and empathetic. "We're not giving up," he told them in March. "But without a body, without a credible sighting, we may never know what happened." "So what do we do?" Ian asked. "Just wait forever?" "You live," Williams Thomas said gently, "as best you can." Autumn came again. November 27th, 1996. 1 year since Ruth disappeared. Police organized another search, another appeal. Nothing came of it. Then, 3 days later, something impossible happened. A newsagent in Dorking called police. A young woman, late teens, visibly distressed, had come in that afternoon. "I need every newspaper you have about Ruth Wilson," she'd said, hands trembling. The owner gathered newspapers from the past week, local titles covering the anniversary. The young woman grabbed them frantically, checking headlines. Then she asked about the Surrey Herald. "I'm sorry, that one sold out." The young woman's face crumpled, nearly in tears. "Are you sure? I need that one." She purchased what was available and rushed out. The owner rewound security footage, watched again. Something felt significant. She called police. Ian and Karen were called to the station to review the footage. They watched grainy black and white video of a young woman at the counter. The image quality was poor, her face only briefly visible, But Karen gasped. "That's her," Karen whispered. "That's Ruth." "I know my daughter." "Are you certain?" the detective asked. "Completely certain," Ian said, voice shaking. "That's our daughter." The implications were staggering. If correct, Ruth was alive. She'd survived the past year. She was close enough to return but hadn't. She was monitoring coverage of her own disappearance. Police canvassed the area, checked other cameras. They found nothing. She'd vanished back into whatever life she was living. The sighting changed everything. Before, there had been grim acceptance. Ruth was probably gone. Now there was renewed hope, painful and persistent. Hope became chronic pain they learned to live with. Years passed. 2000, 2005, 2010. Jenny graduated, married, had children. Ian and Karen aged, gray-haired and lined. They stayed in the cottage because, what if Ruth came back? They kept her room exactly as she'd left it. Operation Scholar remained technically active, but practically cold. Williams-Thomas retired but never forgot Ruth Wilson. Even as investigative journalist, he continued thinking about that 16-year-old who'd disappeared. He stayed in contact with Ian and Karen, calling on anniversaries. But as years became decades, even Williams-Thomas admitted that without something new, the case might never be solved. Ruth Wilson was becoming local legend, cautionary tale, a mystery that defined a place and a family who never stopped looking. Until 2018, when everything changed again. In 2018, 23 years after Ruth Wilson vanished, a television documentary team decided to revisit the case. The project was called Vanished, the Surrey Schoolgirl, and its producers promised fresh examination with modern techniques. What they delivered was explosive. They revealed the secret buried for 36 years. For the first time publicly, the documentary disclosed that Nesta Wilson hadn't died in an accident. She had taken her own life. The family's carefully maintained story about a fall down the stairs was exposed as a lie, told to protect two little girls from a truth their parents believed they couldn't handle. The revelation recontextualized everything. "This changes the entire investigation," Mark Williams-Thomas said on camera, his face tight with frustration. In 1995, Surrey police were working blind. They didn't know Ruth had just discovered her mother's suicide. They couldn't properly assess her state of mind, couldn't evaluate suicide risk. By suppressing this information, they may have hampered the investigation from the start. Ian Wilson, now in his 70s, sat in the same sitting room where he'd waited 23 years. "We thought we were doing the right thing," he said quietly, hands shaking. "Karen and I thought telling the girls their mother fell was kinder than the truth. Ruth was 3 years old. How do you explain suicide to a 3-year-old? We thought we were protecting them." But Ruth had found out. She'd traveled to London, accessed the death certificate, discovered the lie. 2 weeks later, she'd disappeared. The documentary sparked renewed interest in Operation Scholar. Chief Superintendent John Savelle was assigned to conduct formal review, re-examining all evidence with fresh eyes. He assembled a team who spent months analyzing every detail of that November day. Savelle's team identified 5 primary theories, each supported by some evidence, each contradicted by other facts. They presented findings in a press conference that June. Theory 1. Voluntary departure. Savelle began before a room full of journalists. Ruth planned to disappear and start a new life. Supporting this, her calculated actions that day. The flower order timed for 2 days later. The library hours, possibly planning escape. The taxi ride suggesting she was meeting someone. The 1996 CCTV sighting, which her parents firmly believe was Ruth monitoring her own case. He paused. Contradicting this, Ruth had no passport, no driver's license, no significant funds. Her bank card was never activated. No contact for 23 years. In pre-internet 1995, maintaining completely clandestine existence would have been extraordinarily difficult without substantial help. "Do you believe someone helped her?" a journalist asked. "That brings us to Theory 2, facilitated escape." We have Liam Macaulay's analysis. Retired Officer Liam Macaulay appeared via video link, weathered face filling the screen. "Look at what she was wearing," Macaulay said, voice gruff with certainty. "Red knitted jumper, black velvet trousers, pixie boots with no tread. That's not hiking gear. Those are clothes you wear when you're getting into a car, going somewhere indoors. I call it a car hop outfit. Ruth Wilson dressed that morning expecting to be picked up by someone, expecting to be driven away. The taxi driver said she stood there looking around like she was waiting. I believe that someone existed. Find that person, you find what happened to Ruth. But we've never identified any such person, Savell interjected. No witnesses reported seeing another vehicle. No one's come forward in 23 years. The third theory was the one that had dominated investigation from the beginning. Suicide, replication of her mother's choice 13 years later. The farewell letters found at Betchworth Quarry, empty paracetamol packets, timing 2 weeks before Nesta's death anniversary, all pointed toward a young woman in psychological crisis making a terrible final decision. However, Savell said, tone carrying the weight of decades of frustration, we have no body. Ruth Wilson has been missing for 23 years. Boxell is popular hiking destination. Someone would have found remains by now. Thermal imaging detected nothing. 60 volunteers searched every accessible area. Statistical probability of a body remaining undiscovered this long is vanishingly small. Forensic psychologist Dr. Sarah Chen had been brought in to analyze the paracetamol evidence, and her assessment raised troubling questions. Ruth Wilson was studying A-level chemistry and biology, Dr. Chen explained to cameras. She would have understood exactly how paracetamol overdose works. It causes liver failure. It's not quick, not painless. It's agonizing, taking 24 to 72 hours. Victims remain conscious for much of that time. For an intelligent student with scientific knowledge to choose this method seems unlikely. It raises the possibility the paracetamol was staged, meant to suggest suicide, while Ruth was actually planning something else entirely. The fourth and fifth theories, abduction or accidental death, received less attention. Williams Thomas stated his belief that stranger abduction was unlikely given the remote location and Ruth's apparent expectation of meeting someone. Accidental death seemed implausible given the staged evidence and Ruth's deliberate actions. What emerged from the review wasn't a definitive answer but rather clearer picture of impossible contradictions. Ruth had acted with purpose and planning, ordering flowers, taking specific taxis, spending hours in library. She'd dressed for a car ride, not woodland hike. She'd waited on that bridleway as if expecting someone, but she'd also left farewell letters and paracetamol suggesting suicide. She'd discovered devastating family secret 2 weeks before vanishing. Every piece of evidence pointed different directions, and after 23 years, Surrey police were no closer to knowing whether Ruth Wilson was a 40-year-old woman living under new identity somewhere, or whether her remains lay undiscovered in some hidden corner of Boxell. The documentary ended with Ian and Karen Wilson in their sitting room, surrounded by photographs of the daughter they'd last seen as 16. Ruth's bedroom remained untouched upstairs. Her piano sat silent. "If you're out there, Ruth," Ian said to the camera, voice breaking, "please know we love you. We're not angry about what you discovered, about your mother. We just want to know you're safe. That's all we've ever wanted." The review concluded with Savell's frank assessment. Without body, without credible sighting, without new evidence, this case may never be resolved. Ruth Wilson's disappearance remains one of the most perplexing missing persons cases in British history. We keep the investigation open. We keep hoping for answers. But after 23 years, we must acknowledge those answers may never come. November 27, 2025 marked 30 years since Ruth Wilson disappeared. 3 decades. The 16-year-old girl who'd stood on that bridleway would now be 46 years old, middle-aged, possibly with children of her own, or possibly nowhere at all, her bones scattered somewhere in those woods, undiscovered, despite 3 decades of searching. Surrey police held a press conference that morning. DCI Alex Geldart, current lead on Operation Scholar, stood before cameras repeating what had become familiar over the decades. "We continue to keep an open mind about what is behind Ruth's disappearance," he said. "We have no further evidence to support any specific theory. The investigation remains open to new leads. We will never close this case until we have answers." But his tone suggested what everyone knew. After 30 years without a body, without credible sighting, without evidence, the chances of solving Ruth Wilson's disappearance had dwindled to nearly nothing. Ian Wilson was 86 now, his body failing under decades of grief. He still lived in the cottage on Wanham Lane, though Karen had passed 2 years earlier, her heart giving out under the weight of not knowing. Ruth's bedroom remained untouched, a shrine to a girl who would be middle-aged by now. "People ask me why I keep her room like this," Ian said to a journalist covering the 30th anniversary. His voice was thin, papery. "They say it's not healthy, say I need to move on. But what does moving on mean when you don't know if your daughter is alive or dead? How do you grieve someone who might walk through the door tomorrow?" He paused, hands trembling. "I check the mail every day, 30 years, and I still check thinking maybe today there'll be a letter. Dear Dad, I'm sorry it took so long. I'm safe. Please forgive me. That's all I want, just to know." Jenny Wilson, now 47 with teenage children of her own, had learned to live with her sister's absence, the way you learn to live with chronic pain. It never goes away, but you develop strategies for managing it. Her children knew about Aunt Ruth, the sister who'd vanished when their mother was 13, who existed in photographs and stories, and the persistent sadness that sometimes crossed Jenny's face when November approached. "The hardest part isn't the not knowing, though that's terrible," Jenny said. "The hardest part is watching my dad grow old still waiting. He's 86. He's not going to live forever. What haunts him most is the possibility he'll die without ever knowing what happened to Ruth. That's his nightmare, dying with this question still unanswered." Mark Williams Thomas, now a prominent investigative journalist, had never stopped thinking about Ruth Wilson despite covering hundreds of other cases. "I believe Ruth Wilson chose to disappear," he said in his latest interview. "I believe she's alive, or was alive for many years after 1995. I believe someone helped her. Ruth would be 46 now. If she's out there, she's lived an entire adult life under a different name. The question is, does she know we're still looking?" For missing persons organizations, Ruth Wilson had become a case study in the unique torture of ambiguous loss. Unlike families who received bad news and could grieve, the Wilsons existed in permanent limbo. Ruth was neither confirmed dead nor proven alive. She existed in the space between, and that space had consumed 3 decades of their lives. The case had changed how police handled missing persons investigations. Surrey police now trained officers on the importance of full disclosure about family history, particularly regarding mental health and suicide. Ruth Wilson's case proved that well-intentioned secrecy could hamper investigations from the start. "What would I say to Ruth if I could?" Ian asked near the end of his interview. He was quiet for a long moment. "I'd say, I forgive you, for running away, for the secrets, for everything. Your mother's death, we should have told you the truth. That was our mistake, not yours. If you needed to leave, if staying was too painful, I understand." His voice broke. "And if you're out there, if you're alive somewhere, living a different life, I'm happy for you. I hope you found peace. I hope you're not afraid anymore. I don't need you to come home. I just need to know you're all right. Please, Ruth. If you can hear this, just let me know you're safe before I die. That's all I'm asking." The interview aired on Evening News. Millions watched Ian Wilson, ancient and fragile, pleading with his daughter one more time. The phones rang at Surrey Police. Tips came in. None led anywhere. As 2025 drew to a close, Operation Scholar remained technically active. The case never closed. Ruth Wilson existed in official records as a missing person, because without a body there was no death to declare. The truth about Ruth Wilson, whether she'd orchestrated an escape, whether she'd ended her life in some hidden corner of Boxell, whether she'd met foul play, or whether something else entirely had happened, remained locked somewhere between that November evening and now. 30 years of time had buried whatever happened under layers of speculation and fading memories. But the case taught painful, necessary lessons. It showed the devastating weight of family secrets, how lies meant to protect can destroy. It showed the importance of listening to teenagers in crisis, of creating space for truth even when truth is uncomfortable. It showed that disappearance isn't just about the person who leaves, it's about everyone left behind, frozen in the moment of loss, unable to move forward or back. On a rainy November evening in 1995, Ruth Wilson stepped out of a taxi and into permanent mystery. 30 years later, she remained there, Frozen at 16 in photographs and memories, present and absent simultaneously, the girl who vanished into the rain and never came back. Her story wasn't about resolution, because there was no resolution. It was about the weight of not knowing, about families who wait forever, about the questions that outlive the people who ask them. Ruth Wilson's case reminds us that behind every missing person statistic is a family frozen in time, waiting for answers that may never come. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the teenagers in your own life who might be struggling in silence, if it reminded you of the weight that secrets carry, please subscribe to this channel. We tell these stories not for entertainment, but because they matter, because Ruth Wilson mattered, because every missing person deserves to be remembered, searched for, and hopefully, someday, found.